Trying to go live right now, and the Senate is supposed to meet, or to begin rather, here shortly, the session for tonight, but it's not really starting for some reason on my device, so I'm not sure what's going on here. For some reason, it's not playing. So what should we do now? Check history? Try going backward? I am Karthik, and this is the coverage at Vote Count 2020 of the Senate impeachment trial of Donald J. Trump, the 45th President of the United States of America. The continuing coverage now is expected to have started here at the Senate. Trying to pick up our stream so that we can continue our coverage. Created by cable, that's right. So go ahead, don't stop. Why are you stopping? Sorry, folks, I don't know why this is taking so long. I am Karthik Rajan. We are covering the Senate impeachment trial, day 4, in which Democrats continue to present their case that the President of the United States has abused his power
1979
and is obstructing justice.
That happened in the way.
Yeah, they're not back yet. Okay, so after all that fuss and bother, they are not back yet. But we can get it set up. And when we come back, we can be looking at it, right? So let's see here. Right, so at any moment now, I believe they will be coming back. We need to plug this in because we are losing power. Previous session was 3 hours. The session before that was 2 hours. And we want to make sure that we have enough juice to cover what is the next session here now. Let me get you caught up. I am Karthik Rajan. This is Vote Count 2020. What I can tell you is that today began with Adam Schiff and the House managers preparing material in an incredibly organized manner. Jerry Nadler of New York started out by creating a context for the history of impeachments. He introduced the way the framers created the language for impeachment. He talked about the historical definition of the terms of impeachment. How was abuse of power defined? He talked quite specifically about how a high crime was defined, and he divorced the notion that a high crime has anything to do with being convicted of a crime, like when you're convicted of a crime in court. These two things have nothing to do with one another. And Representative Nadler showed a couple of really nice videos that crystallized that from both sides of the aisle. Mr. Nadler then went on to neatly show that what Donald J. Trump has done and is doing is absolutely impeachable under the definition by the framers and by the historical application of impeachment and removal. In fact, the way it's been done in the past and so on, there are examples here where it feels like it's worse than the Nixon situation, because not only is he doing the thing that Nixon was doing, using the office to control elections material, he's using a foreign power, thereby violating the Impoundment Act of 1974. Representative Sylvia Garcia then came up from Texas, a Democrat. She started to apply Trump's case to a broader picture of what she called a scheme. And this became a term that the Democrats would then proceed to use and to define, to flesh out, to say, if this is a scheme, who are the participants and what is the scheme? This was an excellent presentation of that. Then came Zoe Lofgren, who focused on the specifics of the timeline. And she debunked the Biden-Burisma accusations publicly and openly. It was amazing. All the things that Giuliani and Trump have claimed, she proceeded to just lay out, say, okay, well, this is what they're claiming, and these are all debunked. Our Foreign Service said so. Our intelligence community said so. Our State Department said so. Our ambassador said so. This is not what's going on. The Mueller report shows the other thing. Then came the evidence from Representative Lofgren that Giuliani was on the phone a lot, leading up to the harassment of Yovanovitch. Giuliani texting, he fired her, to Lev Parnas. Parnas replying, I pray it happens this time. And the very next day, the terrified phone call, you on the next plane back, and Yovanovitch brought back, April 24th. And proceeded through to Representative Val Demmings, and Representative Jeffries from New York, Demmings from Florida. The Senate will be returning shortly. We're just waiting for that to happen. And I believe that Jeffries will be picking up where he left off. Our shift today and yesterday has been nothing short of brilliant. The entire organizational plan of the Democrats is clear. It is facts. And the lies of the administration and of Giuliani and of the people who are manipulating the government for their own ends are being revealed very clearly, even with the paucity of documents, the paucity of witnesses, even with the obstruction, the second clause here being the issue. We would have so much more to show this, but he's been obstructing it and burying it as well, burying a scheme to manipulate a foreign government to conduct two bogus investigations, phony investigations that everybody in our intelligence community, everybody in our Foreign Service, everybody in the House and Senate had debunked. The president, with his personal lawyer as his agent, went to the Ukraine. When people were in his way, like the ambassador, he just fired the ambassador, even though she was a beloved anti-corruption, excellent Foreign Service agent and ambassador. Then he proceeded to push and push and push. Then he chose things to use in his push. The visit to the White House. And finally, the more terrifying thing, $400 million in aid to an ally that was approved by Congress, that was approved by our Foreign Service, that was approved by our entire intelligence community, that was going to an ally that was facing Russia on the front lines with Russia. He held the money back. And he met with Vladimir Putin. So this has been an amazing revelation in an organized fashion of what can clearly be seen as a highly orchestrated scheme perpetuated by a small group of people who are all in the loop and none of whom work for the agencies who are responsible for this, but rather are a back channel path created illegally and as a clear abuse of power by the President of the United States, Donald J. Trump. And I think that as the evidence begins to pile up, it will become more obvious that we cannot deny anymore what is happening. I don't know what will happen, folks. I do know that these phone calls that come into this TV show are filled with rank idiots and ignorant fools. And so listening to them makes my stomach turn and my mind boil. Shall we try that?
Back in.
Mr. Chief Justice,
Majority Leader is recognized.
I consulted with Congressman Schiff, and it looks like roughly 10:30 tonight, so we may need a short break somewhere between now and 10:30.
Thank you.
Well, our timing was good, wasn't it? There is the Supreme Court Chief Justice, John Roberts.
Mr. Chief Justice, distinguished members of the Senate, counsel to the President, my colleagues, the American people. The second official act that President Trump used to corruptly abuse his power was the withholding of an Oval Office meeting with the President of Ukraine. Before we took the break, we started walking through the overwhelming evidence about how President Trump withheld this official White House meeting that was vitally important to Ukraine as part of a corrupt scheme to convince President Zelensky to announce 2 phony political investigations. These investigations were entirely unrelated to any official US policy and solely benefited President Trump. We talked about why withholding the meeting was so significant to our ally, Ukraine. Ukraine is a fragile democracy under relentless attack from Russian-backed separatists in the East. US support is vitally important to Ukraine in that war. They desperately need our support. They desperately need our assistance. Because of this vast power disparity, President Trump had immense power over Ukraine, and President Trump knew it. So when President Trump asked for a favor on a July 25th call, he knew that President Zelensky would feel incredible pressure to do exactly what President Trump wanted. President Trump used his agents, both his administration appointees and his personal attorney, Rudolph Giuliani, to make clear to Ukraine, even in early July, that much needed White House meeting that they requested would only occur if they announced these phony political investigations. Now, to be clear, as Ambassador Sondland testified, everyone was in the loop. That includes Acting Chief of Staff Mick Mulvaney, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, and Secretary of Energy Rick Perry. Even ahead of the July 25th call, Ambassador Sondland was in close, repeated contact with these officials. His mission: schedule a telephone conversation during which the new Ukrainian leader would personally commit to do the phony investigations sought by President Trump in order to unlock a meeting in the Oval Office. This for that. A quid pro quo.
Pro quo.
Now, this isn't just based on the testimony of witnesses. It is corroborated by texts and emails as well. Let's look at some of that evidence now. On July 13th, for example, Ambassador Sondland emailed National Security Council official Timothy Morrison and made the case for President Trump to call the Ukrainian leader prior to the parliamentary elections scheduled for July 21st. In that email, as the highlighted text shows, Ambassador Sondland said the sole purpose of the call was to assure President Trump that investigations will be allowed to move forward. In other words, to get the Oval Office meeting, President Zelensky had to move forward on the phony political investigations, part of the scheme to cheat in the 2020 presidential campaign. This for that. On July 19th, Ambassador Sondland spoke directly with President Zelensky. He spoke directly with President Zelensky to prepare him for a call with President Trump. Ambassador Sondland coached President Zelensky to use key phrases and reassure President Trump of Ukraine's intention to bend to President Trump's will with respect to the phony investigations that President Trump sought. Ambassador Sondland told Kurt Volker that he gave the Ukrainian leader a full briefing. He's got it. That's what Sondland told Volker. In response, Volker texted, most important is for Zelensky to say that he will help with the investigations. That same day, Ambassador Sondland emailed top administration officials, including Acting Chief of Staff Mulvaney, Secretary Pompeo, and Secretary Perry, to summarize his conversation with Zelensky. In that email, Ambassador Sondland said Zelensky is, quote, prepared to receive POTUS's call. Will assure him, meaning POTUS, that he intends to run a fully transparent investigation and will turn over every stone. Both Acting Chief of Staff Mulvaney and Secretary Perry responded to the email, noting that the head of state call would be scheduled. Secretary Perry wrote, Mick just confirmed the call being set up for tomorrow by NSC, the National Security Council. And Mulvaney responded, I asked NSC to set it up for tomorrow. Neither Mulvaney nor Secretary Perry took issue with the fact that Sondland coached Zelensky to yield to President Trump's pressure campaign. But instead, they took steps to connect the two leaders. Everyone was in the loop. They were aware that during the July 20th call, President Trump intended to solicit foreign interference in the 2020 election and press the Ukrainian leader to announce investigations into former Vice President Biden and the CrowdStrike conspiracy theory. There was no focus on advancing America's foreign policy or national security objectives. The only priority was President Trump's corrupt demand for phony investigations in exchange for an Oval Office meeting. This for that. Here's Ambassador Sondland's testimony confirming this scheme.
Everyone was in the loop. It was no secret. Everyone was informed via email on July 19th, days before the presidential call. As I communicated to the team, I told President Zelensky in advance that assurances to run a fully transparent investigation and turn over every stone were necessary in his call with President Trump.
In his call with President Trump. Now we come to July 25th, the morning of the infamous phone call, the culmination of a months-long campaign to engineer a corrupt quid pro quo. That morning, before the call took place, President Trump provided guidance to Sondland. On the morning of July 25th, he told him that President Zelensky should be prepared to announce the investigations in exchange for the White House meeting. After Sondland's call with President Trump on the morning of July 25th, Sondland urgently tried to reach Kurt Volker. When he could not reach Ambassador Volker by phone, he sent a text that said, call ASAP, and he left a message. Volker testified that he indeed received that message, which involved the following content. Quote, President Zelensky should be clear, convincing, forthright with President Trump about his commitment to fighting corruption, investigating what happened in the past. That refers to the Russian-inspired fake, phony, and false conspiracy theory about Ukraine having been involved in interfering in our 2016 elections. And if he does that, President Trump was prepared to be reassured that he would say yes. Come on, let's get this date for this visit scheduled. Ambassador Volker then conveyed that message approximately 30 minutes before the Trump-Zelensky call to Zelensky's top aide, Andrei Yermak. As you can see on the slide, Ambassador Volker texts Yermak, Zelensky's guy, and says, assuming President Z convinces Trump he will investigate / get to the bottom of what happened in 2016, the White House meeting would get scheduled. This for that. So President Trump talks to Ambassador Sondland. Sondland talks to Ambassador Volker. Volker talks to President Zelensky's aide, Yermak. And then the July 25th call occurs. When Ambassador Sondland testified, he agreed with this sequence, indicating it certainly makes sense. Here is what Sondland had to say.
But the sequence certainly makes sense, right?
Yeah, it does.
You talked to President Trump. You told Kurt Volker to call you. You left a message for Kurt Volker. Kurt Volker sent this text message to Andrei Yermak to prepare President Zelensky. And then President Trump had a phone call where President Zelensky spoke very similar to what was in this text message, right?
Right.
And you would agree that the message in this that is expressed here is that President Zelensky needs to convince Trump that he will do the investigations in order to nail down the date for a visit to Washington, D.C. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Indeed, on the July 25th call, when President Trump asked for a favor, President Zelensky was ready with the magic words. He said, I also wanted to thank you for your invitation to visit the United States, specifically Washington, D.C. On the other hand, I want to assure you that we will be very serious about the case and will work on the investigation. This for that. Read the transcript, President Trump says. We have read the transcript, and it is damning evidence of a corrupt quid pro quo.
Absolutely correct.
The evidence against Donald Trump is hiding in plain sight. During our presentation, we've walked through the serious issues presented in the plain reading of the July 25th call, but now you can see the entire context of how this corrupt parade of horribles unfolded. The quid pro quo was discussed in text messages, emails, voicemails, calls, and meetings amongst top administration officials and top Ukrainian officials. Indeed, President Trump's message was delivered to either President Zelensky or his top aides on 4 different occasions in the month of July. 4 different occasions. On July 2nd in Toronto. On July 10th at the White House. On July 19th, during a call between Zelensky and Ambassador Sondland. And then on July 25th, before the call with the 2 leaders. So before that fateful call on July 25th, President Zelensky understood exactly what needed to be done, a quid pro quo. The evidence of President Trump's grave misconduct does not end with that July 25th call. From that point onward, President Zelensky was on notice that it was President Trump himself who demanded those 2 phony political investigations. After the July 25th call, the Ukrainians followed up with President Trump's direction and began to coordinate with Rudolph Giuliani. the president's political bagman. Acting on the president's orders, U.S. diplomats, including Ambassador Sondland and Ambassador Volker, worked with Mr. Giuliani to continue pressuring Ukraine to announce the phony investigations that President Trump sought in exchange for that Oval Office meeting. This is corruption and abuse of power in its purest form.
Yes, it is.
Over the next 2 weeks, Mr. Giuliani directed Ambassadors Sondland and Volker to negotiate a public statement from President Zelensky announcing the investigations that President Trump corruptly demanded. Here is how Ambassador Sondland described this August timeframe.
Mr. Giuliani conveyed to Secretary Perry, Ambassador Volker, and others that President Trump wanted a public statement from President Zelensky committing to investigations of Burisma and the 2016 election. Mr. Giuliani expressed those requests directly to the Ukrainians, and Mr. Giuliani also expressed those requests directly to us. We all understood that these prerequisites for the White House call and the White House meeting reflected President Trump's desires and requirements.
Deputy Assistant Secretary of State George Kent described the pursuit of President Trump's corrupt demands as, quote, infecting U.S. engagement with Ukraine. Here is his full testimony.
In mid-August, it became clear to me that Giuliani's efforts to gin up politically motivated investigations were now infecting U.S. engagement with Ukraine, leveraging President Zelensky's desire for a White House meeting.
In short, U.S. diplomats responsible for Ukraine policy understood that Giuliani had de facto control over whether the Oval Office meeting would be scheduled and under what circumstances. Mr. Giuliani had been given that level of authority by President Trump, and it was infecting official U.S. policy toward Ukraine. To shake loose the White House meeting, top Ukrainian officials knew that they had to meet with Mr. Giuliani, who John Bolton described as a human hand grenade, who was going to blow everybody up. So on August 2nd, Mr. Giuliani met with Mr. Yermak, President Zelensky's top aide, in Madrid. Giuliani in Madrid, meeting with Zelensky's top aide on August 2nd. Mr. Giuliani made clear in that meeting that President Trump needed more private assurances that Ukraine would pursue the investigations. Mr. Giuliani made clear that President Trump needed a public statement. According to Ambassador Sondland, and this is very important, President Trump did not require that Ukraine actually conduct the investigations in order to secure that White House meeting. The Ukrainian government only needed to announce the investigations because they were phony and they were simply designed to cheat in the 2020 election, solicit foreign interference, and corrupt our democracy to the benefit of President Trump. So the goal was not the investigations themselves, but the corrupt political benefit that President Trump would receive as a result of these announcements. He also wanted to shake this Russia thing and instead blame Ukraine, the fairy tale that Ukraine interfered in the 2016 election. The facts didn't matter to President Trump. He only cared about the personal political benefit of these sought-after investigative announcements. Over the next few weeks, Ambassadors Sondland and Volker worked with Mr. Yermak to draft the public statement for President Zelensky to issue. Ambassador Volker was also in frequent contact with Rudy Giuliani regarding the content of that statement. Now, Rudy Giuliani, of course, is not a Secretary of State. He's not an ambassador. He's not a member of the diplomatic corps. He was working in the political, personal interests of President Trump, interacting with Ukrainian officials.
You can't do that.
On August 9th, Ambassador Volker texted Mr. Giuliani and requested a call to update him on the progress of the negotiations for the statement and discuss the content of what it should include. Volker said that Yermak had, quote, mentioned President Zelensky, making a statement. He suggested that he and Mr. Giuliani get on the phone to make sure I advise Zelensky correctly as to what he should be saying.
Wow. Are you kidding me?
Later that afternoon, Ambassador Sondland suggested to Ambassador Volker that they obtain a draft statement from the Ukrainian government to avoid misunderstandings. Or in other words, make sure that President Trump's political objectives were met. Or in other words, make sure that President Trump's political objectives were met. Ambassador Sondland also reiterated that President Trump would not be satisfied by a vague statement. The Ukrainian leader needed to commit to the phony investigations in explicit terms in order to secure the sought-after Oval Office meeting. This for that. Call records subpoenaed by the House show multiple communications between Ambassador Sondland and Mr. Giuliani on the one hand, and numbers associated with the Office of Management and Budget and the White House on the other. On August 8th, around the time of direct communications between Mr. Giuliani and Mr. Yermak, Mr. Giuliani communicated repeatedly with the White House, sending or receiving 6 text messages and completing several calls. Most notably, late in the evening on August 8th, Mr. Giuliani called the White House in a highly distinctive pattern. At 8:53 p.m., Giuliani texted a White House number. At 10:09, a number identified only as -1 in the White House call records called Mr. Giuliani 5 times in rapid succession. 2 minutes later, Mr. Giuliani attempted to return the call, trying an Office of Management and Budget number, then the White House Situation Room, then the White House switchboard. At 10:28, 16 minutes after Mr. Giuliani tried to call the White House back frantically, Situation Room, Office of Management and Budget, switchboard, and the -1 number connected for 4 minutes and 6 seconds. We should be clear. We do not know what Mr. Giuliani said or even who he talked to. We do not know who was on the other end of that mysterious call with the -1. President Trump refused to produce documents and ordered key witnesses not to testify, hiding part of the truth from the American people. He obstructed our congressional investigation. But we do know that Rudolph Giuliani frantically called the White House late into the night. We do know that he talked to someone at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. And we know that Mr. Giuliani likely talked about the drug deal that John Bolton characterized. Over the next few days, President Zelensky's aide, Mr. Yermak, exchanged drafts of the public statement with Ambassadors Volker and Sondland, who consulted on these drafts with Mr. Giuliani. the Ukrainian officials appeared to finally relent. They agreed to Mr. Giuliani's specific language about the phony political investigations in exchange for the Oval Office meeting. On August 10th, Yermak texted Volker that the Ukrainians were willing to make the requested statements, but only if they received a date for the White House meeting first.
Quid pro quo.
Mr. Yermak texted, quote, "I think it's possible to make this declaration and mention all these things." Yermak, again, is Zelensky's top guy. He later wrote the statement would come out after we receive a confirmation of a date for the White House visit. Ambassador Volker counter-proposed. They would iron out the statement in private, use that to get the date for the meeting in the Oval Office, and then President Zelensky would make the public statement. This for that.
So damning. Come
Mr.
on.
Yermak countered. Once we have a date, we will call for a press briefing announcing upcoming visit and outlining vision for the reboot of the U.S.-Ukraine relationship, including, among other things, Burisma and election meddling and investigations. That was a specific reference to President Trump's corrupt demands. 2 days later, Mr. Yermak sent the draft statement, but the statement did not reference Burisma or the 2016 election. As soon as Mr. Yermak sent the statement, what did Ambassadors Sondland and Volker do? They sought a call with Rudolph Giuliani to see if the statement would suffice. They needed to check in with Mr. Giuliani, who was leading the charge to lock down the corrupt quid pro quo. Let's listen to Ambassador Volker.
This is the first draft of that from Mr. Yermak after the conversations that we had.
And it does not mention Burisma or the 2016 election interference, correct?
It does not.
And you testified in your deposition that you and Ambassador Sondland and Mayor Giuliani had a conversation about this draft after you received it. Is that right?
That is correct.
And Mr. Giuliani said that if the statement did not include Burisma and 2016 election, it would not have any credibility. Is that right?
That's correct.
Mr. Giuliani, acting on behalf of President Trump, made clear that the statement from the Ukrainians had to target Vice President Biden for the reasons outlined earlier today. And it had to mention the conspiracy theory about Ukraine interfering in the 2016 election. After Mr. Giuliani conveyed this on the telephone call, Ambassadors Volker and Sondland texted Mr. Yermak and requested a call to convey that message. Ambassador Volker says, "Hey, Andre, we spoke with Rudy. When is good to call you?" And Ambassador Sondland makes clear the urgency, texting, "Important. Do you have 5 minutes?" Now, Ambassador Volker made clear to Mr. Yermak that the statement needed the two key items Mr. Giuliani required for the president. Here's Ambassador Volker's testimony to that effect.
Hi, Andre. Good talking. Following is text with insert at the end for the two key items. We will work on official request.
And then you'll see the highlighted portion of the next text. The other is identical to your previous one, and then it just adds including these involving Burisma and the 2016 elections. Is that right?
That is correct.
And that was what Mr. Giuliani insisted on adding to the statement?
That's what he said would be necessary for that to be credible.
And the Ukrainians ultimately did not issue this statement. Is that right?
That is correct.
And President Zelensky ultimately did not get the Oval Office meeting either, did he?
Not yet.
President Zelensky is still waiting for that Oval Office meeting. Ronald Reagan, in a speech that he delivered in 1987 at the foot of the Berlin Wall, in the midst of the Cold War, said to the world, East and West do not mistrust each other because we are armed. We are armed because we mistrust each other. And our differences are not about weapons, but about liberty. The Trump-Ukraine scandal is certainly about weapons. It's about the unlawful withholding of $391 million in security aid. It's about a withheld, sought-after Oval Office meeting. It's about trying to cheat in the 2020 election. It's about corrupting our democracy. It's about undermining America's national security. It's about a stunning abuse of power. It's about obstruction of Congress. It's about the need for us here in this great chamber to have a fair trial with witnesses and evidence. It's about a corrupt quid pro quo. But perhaps above all else, it's about liberty. Because in America, for all of us, what keeps us free from tyranny is the sacred principle that in this great country, no one is above the law.
Representative Jeffries, Democrat of New York. Rather impressive linking there of the timeline down to the specifics. Now here once again, Sylvia
Mr. Chief Justice,
Garcia,
Senators, President's
Representative,
Council,
Democrat of Texas.
we reviewed the mountain of evidence that proves the President's officials act in his scheme. The corrupt bargain of a White House meeting in exchange for Ukraine announcing sham political investigations. You heard from each relevant witness with first-hand knowledge of the President's corrupt scheme. Sondland, Taylor, Volker, Hill, and Vindman. That there was a corrupt deal, an Oval Office meeting for investigations, quid pro quo, this for that. You also saw inescapable documentary proof that clearly proves a corrupt quid pro quo. The evidence is consistent, corroborated. It comes from in many forms, from many individuals who are lifelong public servants with no motivation to lie. In short, the evidence is overwhelming. Given how much we have gone through, let's review some of those career public servants' testimony who state clearly that they too believed it was a quid pro quo, a this for that. Because it is really powerful to hear directly from them. So let's watch Ambassador Taylor.
By mid-July, it was becoming clear to me that the meeting President Zelensky wanted was conditioned on the investigations of Burisma and alleged Ukrainian interference in the 2016 US elections. It was also clear that this condition was driven by the irregular policy channel I had come to understand was guided by Mr. Giuliani.
It was clear. This were conditions driven by irregular policies. And we know this too because Ambassador Sondland said so at the July 10 meeting. Dr. Fiona Hill described the scene in Ambassador Bolton's office where the quid pro quo was made clear. Let's watch.
The Ukrainians, Mr. Danylyuk, starts to ask about a White House meeting, and Ambassador Bolton was trying to parry this back. Although he's the national security advisor, he's not in charge of scheduling the meeting. We have input recommending the meetings, and this goes through a whole process. So it's not Ambassador Bolton's role to start pulling out the schedule and start saying, right, well, we're going to look and see if this Tuesday and this month is going to work with this. And he does not, as a matter of course, like to discuss the details of these meetings. He likes to leave them to, the appropriate staff for this. So this was already going to be an uncomfortable issue. As Ambassador Bolton was trying to move that part of the discussion away, I think he was going to try to deflect it onto another wrap-up topic, Ambassador Sondland leaned in basically to say, well, we have an agreement that there will be a meeting if specific investigations are put underway. And that's when I saw Ambassador Bolton stiffen. I was sitting behind him in the chair, and I saw him sit back slightly like this. He'd been more moving forward like I am to the table. And for me, that was an unmistakable body language, and it caught my attention. And then he looked up to the clock and, at his watch or towards his wrist in any case. Again, I was sitting behind him, and basically he said, well, it's been really great to see you. I'm afraid I've got another meeting.
Ambassador Bolton stiffened. Quite a description. Lieutenant Colonel Vintman's testimony is consistent with Dr. Hill's recollection of the July 10 meeting. And it was made clear that the deal for the White House meeting was investigations. Let's watch Lieutenant Colonel Vintman.
I want to move now to that July 10th meeting that you referenced, Colonel Vindman. What exactly did Ambassador Sondland say when the Ukrainian officials raised the idea of a White House meeting?
As I recall, he referred to specific investigations that Ukrainians would have to deliver in order to get these meetings.
Lieutenant Vindman, firsthand knowledge, they would have to deliver in order to get these meetings. It was also clear that this wasn't about general investigations about corruption. This was about corruption. It wasn't about corruption at all. Ambassador Sondland directed everyone, including the Ukrainian officials, to reconvene in the ward room, where he discussed the arrangement he had reached with Mr. Mulvaney in more detail. And he made clear that it was about specific investigations that would benefit President Trump personally. Here's Lieutenant Colonel Vindman testifying where he explains that Ambassador Sondland referred to the Bidens, Burisma, and the 2016 election, which had nothing to do with national security policy. Let's watch.
Were the investigations, the specific investigations that Ambassador Sondland referenced in the larger meeting also discussed in the wardroom meeting?
They were.
What did Ambassador Sondland say?
Ambassador Sondland referred to investigations into the Bidens, Burisma in 2016.
How did you respond, if at all?
I said that this request to conduct these meetings was inappropriate. These investigations was inappropriate and had nothing to do with national security policy.
Nothing to do with national security policy. That's about sums it up, doesn't it? It has nothing to do with national security policy. President Trump's scheme was for his personal interest, not national security. And his testimony, once again, is corroborated. Dr. Hill joined the ward room conversation later and also recalled the discussion of investigations in a White House meeting, and the Lieutenant Colonel Vindman said, quote, This is inappropriate. We're the National Security Council. We cannot be involved in this. Here's her testimony.
And so when I came in, Gordon Sondland was basically saying, well, look, we have a deal here that there will be a meeting. I have a deal here with Chief of Staff Mulvaney. There will be a meeting if the Ukrainians open up or announce these investigations and into 2016 in Burisma. And I cut it off immediately there. Because by this point, having heard Mr. Giuliani over and over again on the television and all of the issues that he was asserting, by this point, it was clear that Burisma was code for the Bidens, because Giuliani was laying it out there. I could see why Colonel Vindman was alarmed. And he said, this is inappropriate. We're the National Security Council. We can't be involved in this.
And what's more, as Ambassador Sondland told us, everyone was in the loop. Meaning it became clear that President Trump was directing this. And Dr. Hill, who at one point confronted Gordon Sondland over this arrangement, further reached the conclusion that he was acting on the president's orders and coordinating with other senior officials. He had made this clear. He was briefing the president on all this. Here's Dr. Hill's testimony. Let's watch.
So I was upset with him that he wasn't fully telling us about all of the meetings that he was having. And he said to me, but I'm briefing the president. I'm briefing Chief of Staff Mulvaney. I'm briefing Secretary Pompeo, and I've talked to Ambassador Bolton. Who else do I have to deal with? And the point is we have a robust interagency process that deals with Ukraine. It includes Mr. Holmes. It includes Ambassador Taylor as the chargé in Ukraine. It includes a whole load of other people. But it struck me yesterday when you put up on the screen Ambassador Sondland's emails and who was on these emails. And he said, these are the people who need to know, that he was absolutely right, because he was being involved in a domestic political errand. And we were being involved in national security, foreign policy. And those two things had just diverged.
So the evidence is very clear. The White House meeting would only be scheduled if Ukraine announced the investigations that everyone, including the Ukrainians, understood to be purely political efforts to benefit the president. The only way to come to a different conclusion is to ignore the evidence. One additional way you can tell that this conduct is truly corrupt and not U.S. foreign policy, as usual, is that these officials, these lifetime career public servants, didn't just testify about this in impeachment proceedings. They contemporaneously reported this conduct in real time. Their reactions illustrate that this was not the kind of thing that both parties do when they have the White House. This was something different, something corrupt, something insidious, to use Ambassador Sondland's characterization in later testimony. The officials who instinctively recoiled from the corrupt deal that Sondland blurted out were distinguished, patriotic public servants. Let's go through some specific examples of that evidence. After the July 10 meeting we just talked about, where Ambassador Sondland made clear the agreement that the White House meetings were conditioned on the investigations, Dr. Hill consulted with Ambassador Bolton and told him what she had heard. Ambassador Bolton gave her, as she put it, very specific instruction to report this conduct in real time, and she did. Here is her testimony. Let's watch.
A specific instruction was that I had to go to the lawyers, to John Eisenberg, our senior counsel for the National Security Council, to basically say, you tell Eisenberg, Ambassador Bolton told me, that I am not part of this whatever drug deal that Mulvaney and Sondland are cooking up.
What did you understand him to mean by the drug deal that Mulvaney and Sondland were cooking up?
I took it to mean investigations for a meeting.
Did you go speak to the lawyers?
I certainly did.
Again, investigations for a meeting, the quid pro quo. Consistent with Dr. Hill's recounting, after both the July 10 meeting and the July 25 call, Lieutenant Vindman reported that he had learned to the lawyers. Here he is discussing that later interaction. Let's see it.
You went immediately and you reported it, didn't you?
I did,
Why?
because that was my duty.
Lyndon Vindman said he reported this conduct again because that was his duty. He acted as he did out of a sense of duty. And as a Purple Heart veteran with confidence in America, he would be protected for doing this right thing, even if it angered the President of the United States. His father, who fled the Soviet Union to come to this country, worried about his son fulfilling that duty. Here was Colonel Vindman's message to his father. Let's listen.
Dad, my sitting here today in the U.S. Capitol talking to our elected officials is proof that you made the right decision 40 years ago to leave the Soviet Union and come here to the United States of America in search of a better life for our family. Do not worry, I'll be fine for telling the truth.
You realized when you came forward out of sense of duty that you were putting yourself in direct opposition to the most powerful person in the world. Do you realize that, sir?
I knew I was assuming a lot of risk.
And I'm struck by that word, don't worry, that phrase, do not worry, you addressed to your dad. Was your dad a warrior?
He did serve. It was a different military, though.
And he would have worried if you were putting yourself up against the President of the United States, is that right?
He deeply worried about it because in his context, there was the ultimate risk.
And why do you have confidence that you can do that and tell your dad not to worry?
Congressman, because this is America. This is the country I've served and defended, that all of my brothers have served, and here, right matters.
Thank you, sir. Yield back.
Imagine he had to tell his father, do not worry, I'll be fine for telling the truth. It was his duty because in America, right matters. President Trump has
Republican
suggested
senators
that
in
all
there.
the
They're just
witnesses
they're not gonna care.
are never Trumpers. That couldn't be further from the truth. As we just saw, this U.S. officials are brave public servants. It is wrong, just flat wrong, to suggest that we're doing anything other than testifying out of a sense of duty, as Lieutenant Colonel Vindman testified. But it wasn't just U.S. officials whose reactions show us that this was wrong. It is also clear how corrupt this scheme was because Ukraine resisted it. President Zelensky was elected as a reformer. His first few months in office, he lived up to this promise. Here is Ambassador Taylor testifying on this point. Let's see it.
Once I arrived in Kyiv, I discovered a weird combination of encouraging, confusing, and ultimately alarming circumstances. First, the encouraging. President Zelensky was reforming Ukraine in a hurry. He appointed reformist ministers and supported long-stalled anti-corruption legislation. He took quick executive action, including opening Ukraine's high anti-corruption court. With a new parliamentary majority stemming from snap elections, President Zelensky changed the Ukrainian constitution to remove absolute immunity from Rada deputies, the source of raw corruption for 2 decades. The excitement in Kyiv was palpable. This time could be different, a new Ukraine finally breaking from its corrupt post-Soviet past.
So we know that President Zelensky was a reformer, fighting corruption, fighting for reform, and he got started early as soon as he was sworn in. We know that President Zelensky's agenda was in our U.S. national interest. In fact, every witness testified that President Zelensky deserved America's support and that they told President Trump that. So keeping that in mind, it is extremely telling what President Zelensky and his aides were saying behind closed doors. They were concerned about being dragged into President Trump's scheme. They recognized the political peril of going along with the president's corrupt scheme. We know that from the case for many reasons. But let's look at some of the evidence showing that now. First, the Ukrainians made their concerns clear directly to U.S. officials. On July 20, just days ahead of the July 25 call, Ambassador Taylor spoke with President Zelensky's national security advisor. He then conveyed to Ambassador Sondland and Volker that the Ukrainian leader, quote, did not want to be used as a pawn in a U.S. re-election campaign. Here's Ambassador Taylor explaining what he understood that to mean. Let's watch.
What did you understand it to mean when that Zelensky had concerns about being an instrument in Washington domestic re-election politics?
Mr. Daniluk understood that these investigations were pursuant to Mr. Giuliani's request to develop information, to find information about Burisma and the Bidens. This was very well known in public. Mr. Giuliani had made this point clear in several instances in the beginning, in the springtime, and Mr. Daniluk was aware that that was a problem.
And would you agree that because President Zelensky is worried about this, they understood at least that there was some pressure for them to pursue these investigations? Is that fair?
Mr. Daniluk indicated that President Zelensky certainly understood it, that he did not want to get involved in these type of activities.
As the slide shows, on July 21, Ambassador Taylor relayed the same message to Ambassadors Volker and Sondland, making clear, quote, President Zelensky is sensitive about Ukraine being taken seriously, not merely as an instrument in Washington domestic politics. But Ambassador Sondland did not back down. Instead, Ambassador Sondland reinforced the importance that President Zelensky reassure President Trump of his commitment to the investigations. He said, quote, absolutely, but we need to get the conversation started and the relationship built, irrespective of the pretext. I'm worried about the alternative. The pretext that Ambassador Sondland referred to was President Trump's requirement that Ukraine announce investigations that would benefit him personally and politically. He wanted help in cheating. And it wasn't just Ambassador Taylor. Deputy Assistant Secretary George Kent, too, testified that Ukraine was, quote, very uncomfortable when the issue of investigations was raised during the negotiations of the statement in August of 2019. As the slide shows, Mr. Kent said, quote, I had a conversation with Sergei Taylor in which he indicated that Special Representative Volker had been engaging with Andriy Yermak, that the president and his private attorney, Rudy Giuliani, were interested in the initiation of investigations, and that Yermak was very uncomfortable when this was raised with him, and suggested that if that were the case, if that were really the position of the United States, it should be done officially and put in writing. And I told Bill Taylor That's wrong. And we shouldn't be doing that as a matter of U.S. policy. And when asked, what did he say? Mr. Kent said, quote, he said he agreed with me. Now, what's also important to note is this: why? Ukraine made this clear. If the U.S. was asking them for investigations, especially investigations that made them uncomfortable, they should be done officially and put in writing. Mr. Kent's testimony shows that. He said, quote, Yermak was very uncomfortable when this was raised with him and suggested if that were the case, if that were really the position of the United States, it should be done officially and put in writing. And this wasn't the only time. On August 13, Mr. Yermak asked Ambassador Volker, quote, whether any request had ever been made by the United States to investigate election interference in 2016. Now, this makes sense. Normally, if something is actually about official U.S. policy, the president would go through official U.S. channels. But as we've seen here, he didn't. His personal attorney made this. This wasn't about foreign policy. It was something that would benefit President Trump personally. The administration officials made this clear too. There were undisputed testimony that the investigations were not part of U.S. policy. In fact, they diverged with the U.S. national security and our nation's values. And the Department of Justice has made this crystal clear in public statements. They have never been asked officially to do any of these investigations. And that's how we know this is so very wrong. Even Ukraine, a struggling new country, knew this was wrong. And they stood up to President Trump and said so. Yermak, and remember he was Zelensky's chief aide, was basically saying, you want an investigation? Please send us a formal request from DOJ. Show us you're willing to stand behind the legitimacy of what you're asking. But Ambassador Volker was unable to provide that information. And that's why, even though the White House meeting was so critical to Ukraine, even though Ukraine needed it so desperately, they still wouldn't make the statement with the key additions. President Trump's political investigations, which were solely to help his reelection, and had nothing to do with foreign policy. President Zelensky tried different ways to resist the pressure of becoming a pawn in U.S. politics. Even though the Oval Office meeting was important, Zelensky repeatedly tried to find a way around committing to the investigations that President Trump demanded, or at the very least, schedule it before taking any official action. This is what you saw in the negotiation over the statement in August. And this is why even President Trump's second official act, withholding the White House meeting, was not enough to make Ukraine do his dirty work. Senators, we're coming to the end of the section of the presentation regarding the withholding of the White House meeting. So I want to just quickly remind us one last time about the central points that we've covered. President Trump exercised his official power when he withheld an Oval Office meeting that was critical to Ukraine. And he did this for only one reason, and one reason only. President Trump conditioned that Oval Office meeting on Ukraine, announcing investigations that would help him politically. This had nothing to do with official U.S. policy. President Trump directed U.S. officials were supposed to work for the American people, to work instead with his personal agent, Rudy Giuliani, and focus only on his personal political interests. Acting on behalf of the president and with the president's full knowledge, Mr. Giuliani worked with those U.S. officials to carry out the president's scheme. They pressured the Ukrainian government to ask as a personal opposition research firm for President Trump. They tried to use a foreign government to dig up dirt on his client's rival, former Vice President Biden, an American citizen. And so President Trump could win his election. And they made clear that Ukraine would not get the official U.S. government support that it so desperately needed. Support that the president's national security team conveyed was necessary to advance our own national security objectives unless President Zelensky announced the sham investigations. Remember that an abuse of power occurs when the president corruptly exercises official power to obtain a personal benefit in a way that ignores or injures the national interest. Senators, that is exactly what happened here. By withholding a White House meeting, President Trump used official power to corruptly pressure Ukraine. Indeed, the entire quid pro quo, the this for that, the entire campaign to use the Oval Office meeting as some kind of asset for the president's reelection campaign was corrupt. Officials knew this. Ukrainians knew this too. And I think deep down, we all know it. And I think the American people know it. Senators, I ask you this one question. Is that not an abuse of power? Was it okay? If it's not an abuse of power, then what is? Is it okay to withhold official acts from a foreign country until that foreign country assists your reelection effort? If any other public official did that, he or she would be held accountable. I know that if one of us did that, we would be held accountable. The only way to hold this president accountable is right here in this trial. Otherwise, you would be telling Ukraine and the world that it's okay for the president to use our Oval Office and this country's prestige and power for himself instead of for the American people. If we allow this gross abuse of power to continue, this president would have free rein to abuse his control of U.S. foreign policy for personal interests. And so would any other future president. And then this president and all presidents become above the law. A president could take the powers of the greatest office in this land and use those powers not for the country, not for the American people, but for him or herself. I ask you to make sure this does not happen, because in this country, no one is above the law. Nadie se está encima de la ley. Now I yield to Ms. Demmings.
Majority Leader is recognized.
Mr. Chief Justice, the House managers have requested a 5-minute break.
So ordered.
Okay, so we're going to take a 5-minute break, folks. And while we do that,
Senate is in recess.
C-SPAN is going to go to phone calls, all right? I'm Karthik Rajan, also known as MT Karthik. This is Vote Count 2020, and we are covering...
All right, we're going to try to get some phone calls in and get your reaction to what's happening. 5 minutes. The Senate will come back abruptly. We will go back live as soon as that happens.
I'm going to let this roll.
Let's hear from Christine in Apple Valley, California on our Republican line. Hi, Christine.
Hi, how are you?
What have you heard today?
What I've heard today, I think this is a three-ring circus. Okay, the whole impeachment deal. I voted for Trump. Okay, I admit he has some issues. Other than that, I think this is a railroad from the get-go, like I tell my neighbor. They've been trying to get him out since he got into office. I think we're wasting the taxpayers' time. I think we're wasting everybody's time. Let him finish out his term. If he gets the next election, great. If he doesn't, oh well. But I think we're wasting everybody's time with this impeachment trial.
So you
What do
heard
think
nothing.
about the call for witnesses?
I'm up and down on that. Okay, I've been following politics too long. I've been a Republican too long. And you know what? This isn't working. But I will tell you, the Hamilton stuff with the Democrats that needs to cut. They're wasting a lot of time.
That's Christine in Apple Valley, California. Up next is Frank.
That's Moron in
Birmingham,
Moronville.
Alabama, Democrats line. Frank,
There we go.
what's your reaction?
My reaction is one of the greatest statements I just heard when Garcia played the tape of the military man who read the letter. And the three words was there: America has to be right. She can't sell herself to North Korea. She can't sell herself to China. She can't even sell herself here, as Trump has done, to Russia, if this kind of carrying on is going on. Now, again, Adam Schiff was so delineated and so unequivocally clear until Lindsey Graham himself in the hallways, and I'm glad you guys got it, had to tell Adam Schiff he did a great job. And they have done a great job of proving, again, unequivocally, this quid pro quo. I mean, again, the letters, how can Americans act like they're blind as all this information is being delineated unequivocally to the public? Anybody that's paying any sense, if you blind, ignorant, and crippled and crazy, then it's just no hope for me and like myself. I was a gang member, incarcerated, and I got saved, been on the 700 Club with Pat Robinson and them, and got my life changed.
Okay, a little too much, son.
The way that these people are acting now on the other side over there, under In God We Trust, swear before God, will sit in that deliberating, most powerful body, second to the president himself, the Senate. And the senators themselves will sit up there and then come out and talk and give interviews to you guys. And let me say this to Senator Scott of South Carolina. You from the state that where the first bullets was launched in the Civil War. And for a black man to stand in there and to be complicit to this is absolutely ridiculous and is mind-boggling, and I do not understand. And as a reformed convict, it really makes me want to go back and break laws, because if the president of the United States can break laws, why can't I?
Frank, what have you been doing since you've been out of the gangs and out of prison?
I got appointed out of gangs. I started dealing with gangs in Birmingham. The mayor, first black mayor of Birmingham appointed me as a gang liaison to deal with the gang problem. President Clinton has honored me. I've been with Obama, and so I've led marches against gangs. And matter of fact, I did the largest gun buyback, and with Abraham Woods, president at CLC, first gun buyback in America, where we was able to get 411 guns in 1 hour off the street. No one has beat that record. So I unequivocally has given my life to the system. I got a pardon. I ran for mayor twice. I was the first African-American in my district, District 2, to run against a white person and get in a runoff with all my criminal history. That's how committed I've been to this flag, to this anthem, and to this country. But now I kneel at the anthem, and I will not sing it, because what 45 has done has just demoralized me. And this man has been, I was arrested 33 times before I was 19 years old. This guy's more criminal than me. And I am ashamed of my crime. And thank God they forgave me, and people forgave me too. But with this president and those that are backing him, it is absolutely ridiculous. And it's an insult to any person who's been incarcerated. They had to go before a jury, where a jury could not have the evidence like these senators. They had evidence, they look at the evidence, and then they sit in there and hear evidence. I mean, no one in America gets this kind of trial.
So, Frank, what about the argument that the House should have called these witnesses, subpoenaed these witnesses, taken their time a little bit more?
Again, the president would not allow them to go. He said he's going to have institute executive privilege to keep those individuals from testifying. They did everything again. Let me just say this too, going back to myself. A lot of crimes that I committed, I admitted I was guilty and just went on and did what happened, what was due me. The president, whatever he thought he was doing, if he absolutely didn't think he was wrong, what was done was wrong. So a good person would just come forth and say, I was wrong in what I was trying to do. I seen this country was moving towards corruption. I feel that Biden and his son might have been part of it. So come on over to the White House. And if you and like another thing that really stirred me in Garcia's dissertation, when she said the Ukrainian president wanted the Department of Justice to investigate it and give him notification that they would handle it, he would be willing to be complicit, and that never happened.
All right, Frank in Birmingham, thanks for calling in. Derek, you've heard what the House managers have had to say. You heard what Frank in Birmingham had to say. What's your reaction?
My reaction is it was a railroad in the Congress. That now that we're in the Senate, it's a fair trial, whether the Democrats are complaining or not. The president has done more for this country than presidents before him, and us Republicans stand united. Go Trump.
Derek in Runge, Texas. This is Kurt.
That's retard in
Cheyenne,
Runge.
Wyoming, Independent Line.
Hey, good evening. Look, just from not the previous caller, the one that was previous to Trumper there, I just want to say to him in Birmingham, don't give up hope, brother. You keep going. I can relate to him. I don't have my voting rights right now because of a felon. That's on me. Shame on me. I did 4 years of counseling and I changed my life around. People can change, but right now, I just have to say that, one of the reasons I called on the independent line is that I don't like to be pigeonholed as either a Democrat or a Republican. I really truly feel this society of ours is, if we don't wake up, people, we have to wake up and pick up ourselves up out of our silos and listen to the other side,
All right, I am going to fade out that gentleman. We are in a recess at the moment, and you're getting an idea of why I don't usually let the C-SPAN phone calls roll over. C-SPAN.org is, of course, the nonprofit founded in the 1970s, 1979 by cable television. An excellent resource, one of the best we have for nonpartisan coverage, not only of things like impeachment, unique events, but daily congressional activity. And they constantly have the phone-in lines. And I do encourage you to call and to feedback. I'm impatient because I'm not participating in that. And so I shouldn't judge the callers. And I apologize for that. But the fact is, I don't really want to listen to the callers right now. If I did, I would be online doing that. Instead, what we're doing is we are listening to and watching the Senate impeachment trial. And we've just heard from Sylvia Garcia, Democrat of Texas, who gave a remarkable presentation. Again, this is all starting to link together, and each of the House managers is presenting a different section, if you will, a different area. And they said they were going to be back in about 5 minutes, so we're just going to see if that does happen. And the section that just finished related to the question of the memo. I can't. Oh, here they're coming back. Let's see what's going on here.
Democrats are presenting a solid case with limited information. They have not been able to receive the documents nor be able to talk to the witnesses. And they still have a very strong case. What I'm hearing from the Senate right now of the Republicans is just pontification of arbitrary things. They don't care about the facts. They are in lockstep. Their comments are all the same. It makes me fearful of what is happening to the government.
That was Stephen in Minneapolis. Now, the House impeachment managers, the Democrats, have 24 hours. They have about 11 left. Then the Trump defense team gets 24 hours. Then the senators get 16 hours to ask questions. After that, there's a 4-hour debate on whether documents and witnesses should be included in this phase of the trial. All live on C-SPAN 2. Kyle, Elizabeth, New Jersey, Republican, go ahead.
I don't want to listen to the callers. That was an accident. I thought they were showing, I thought I saw Senator Sanders actually walking back into the hallway. They say they're on a 5-minute break. That's one of the reasons why we're killing time right now, and so is C-SPAN. I was trying to pick up the thread of what Representative Sylvia Garcia's segment was. You can, of course, go back and watch that. And in her work, she included a lot of the professional members of the Foreign Service, the hardworking men and women who have worked for Republican presidents and Democratic presidents, whose job is at the very front line of representing America in foreign countries, in scary places in some instances, where they don't like the United States of America, in other places where there's, extremely subtle relationships. These men and women, the Foreign Service, are an independent from who becomes president. They are an intelligence community that we have built over decades. They have the most information. They have degrees in their area. They speak the language. To think that all of their intellect and all of their prowess and all of their good hard work had been summarily dumped so that Trump and Giuliani could do what they wanted was presented in Representative Garcia's presentation through several of these people saying why they had to answer the subpoena and come to Congress. All of them had been told, don't answer the subpoena by the president. And all of whom knew what a risk it was to them and their careers to step forward and say something. She pointed out, Representative Garcia did, that these are hardworking men and women who have been public servants their whole lives long. And besmirching them is not something that we should be thinking about when we discuss what it is that they're very evidently saying. And these are only the people we've been able to subpoena, the ones who are willing to step forward. I had watched that during the House impeachment trial, and you can see that too. And when it happened live, I wept when the young man whose parents emigrated from the Soviet Union related to telling his dad not to worry about telling the truth because America stands for being, in the right. I cried when it happened, and I cried again just now when it was presented in the Senate. I think as an immigrant, when we think about our parents coming to this country and committing to it, and then we think about our own commitments to it, and to the Constitution of the United States of America, things like that are meaningful to us in a way maybe that to some of you you've forgotten or, I don't know. But this is clear to me. It's unbelievable that this should be a near unanimous vote. The Republicans should be willing to have Pence be president, go find another candidate. The man does not have the temperament for the job, and he has expressed his ego using the power of the office blatantly in this instance, and we don't know in how many countless others because there aren't or haven't been whistleblowers in those areas yet. And I don't know how to say that this substantiates something that we've all thought and felt and wondered about this man, and it is time for us to take the proper action. He must be impeached, and he should be removed from office. He does not have the temperament for the job. He seems and often acts unhinged. He is not well educated in multidisciplines to where he can engage with a Russian or with a Korean or with a Japanese in an informed way. He's a businessman at best, a TV entertainer more accurately. and his willingness to do whatever he wants, his ego expression is far beyond the Constitution and our set of right and wrong in the checks and balances system. A president is not a king, and he behaves like a king and justifies it to the world. And it's got to be stopped. It's got to be stopped. I don't know how else to say that. We're meant to be back. I guess we'll listen to a few more phone calls. I don't really like listening to phone. I'm starting to get quite tired myself. I've been at this now for days and days and days.
Yes, I do.
And what's it like to discuss politics in that city?
It's pretty red over here. There are very few Democrats, so I just went to California recently, and that was quite an ordeal. But everybody's on Trump's side on this over here where we are.
Are you shy about bringing up your political points of view?
Absolutely not. I welcome it.
All right. Let's hear from Pam in Chicago, Democrat. Hi, Pam.
Hi, how are you?
Good.
Oh, I just wanted to say that I did like what Senator Ted Cruz had to say, and that what I would like to see, if they bring any witnesses, is the prosecutor from Ukraine. I think that would be a good witness. So let's see what he has to say. But Senator Ted Cruz put forth a very good argument yesterday at the very end, and I am a Democrat, but I am really interested in what was going on with, then Vice President Biden, and, even what's the whole basis of being able to make that request to begin with. So I heard the talk today about it was legal for Vice President Biden to make that request, but I'd like to learn more about that.
What kind of work do you do in Chicago, Pam?
I'm a librarian, and I substitute teach.
All right. Thanks for calling in. Connie, Marshall, Wisconsin, Independent Line. Connie, go ahead.
Hi. I'm concerned about how most people just take other people's words, like the.
Connie, we're all listening.
Okay. Like
you know what? You gotta turn down your TV and don't look at your TV. Just talk on the phone. Go ahead.
Yeah. Okay. I hope that we can get these people in for witnesses and just see what's going on. A trial is not a trial without witnesses.
And the House is back, or the Senate is back in
Majority
session.
Leader is recognized.
If I may, one brief announcement. In the morning, there'll be a coronavirus briefing for all members at 10:30. Senator Alexander and Senator Murray are involved in that. The location will be emailed to your office.
I am Karthik Rajan. This is Vote Count 2020, and we are back with the Senate impeachment trial of Donald J. Trump.
Chief Justice Roberts,
this is Val
senators,
Demmings,
and counsel for the
Democrat
president.
of Florida.
We have now been through the first two official acts by the president, but neither of those official acts got the president what he wanted: help in his re-election campaign. So he turned to another official act to turn up the pressure even more, withholding nearly $400 million of vital military assistance to Ukraine in exchange for the investigations. Withholding military assistance to Ukraine made the original abuse of power, soliciting foreign interference in our elections, that much worse. But it was also in and of itself an abuse of power. And not only that, it violated the law. It was illegal. The Government Accountability Office, a nonpartisan independent agency, concluded that President Trump's hold on the security assistance clearly violated the Impoundment Control Act.
Thank you.
A law that Congress enacted to curb President Nixon's own abuse
That's
of
exactly
power.
right. That's exactly right.
Now, President Trump may not like it, but once a law is passed, the president cannot change that law without coming back to us, the Congress. And President Trump did not just break the law, he jeopardized our national security, because Ukraine's national security is our national security. How? Because a free and democratic Ukraine is a shield against Russian aggression in Europe. That has been one of America's most important foreign policy and national security goals since World War II. Freedom, liberty, democracy, those values keep us safe. Let us now explain how President Trump's improper withholding of military assistance was clearly done to pressure Ukraine to announce the two baseless investigations, a gross abuse of power. First, we will briefly describe how important the military aid was to Ukraine's defense against Russian aggression, which affects our security. Second, we will explain how President Trump used the power of his office to freeze military aid to Ukraine in a way meant to conceal it from Congress. And third, we will present the overwhelming evidence that President Trump ordered the hold for a corrupt purpose, to pressure Ukraine to announce two investigations that would personally benefit his own re-election effort. Let us start with the importance of the aid to the United States national security. The United States has supported Ukraine since it secured independence from the Soviet Union in 1991. Our support was critical to convince Ukraine to forego its pursuit of a nuclear arsenal in 1994. We promised them that we would defend them if necessary, but our support became truly vital in 2014 when Ukraine revolted against its Russian-friendly president, Viktor Yanukovych. Ukrainian citizens rose up in protest, demanding democratic reforms and an end to corruption. The protests, rightly known as the Revolution of Dignity, removed the pro-Kremlin president. Russia responded by using its own military forces and proxies in Ukraine to invade Ukraine.
Crimea.
This was the first effort to redraw European boundaries by military force since World War II. The war was devastating to Ukraine and remains so today. Approximately 7% of Ukraine's territory is now occupied by Russia. Approximately 15,000 people have been killed as a result of the conflict, and over 1.4 million people have been displaced. In response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the United States and our allies imposed sanctions on Russian individuals and entities and agreed to provide billions of dollars in assistance to support Ukrainian sovereignty and democratic development. We understood immediately, Democrats and Republicans alike, that Ukraine's safety and security was directly tied to our safety and security. With this goal in mind, since 2014, the United States has delivered roughly $1.5 billion in security assistance and another $1.5 billion in other assistance to our ally, Ukraine. Our allies in Europe have provided approximately $18 billion in loans and grants since 2014. As we have explained, the U.S. assistance comes partially from the Department of Defense, which provides important military support, It comes partially from the State Department, which helps Ukraine purchase military services or equipment manufactured by American companies in the United States. Ambassador Taylor explained how security assistance counters Russian aggression and can help shorten the war in the East. Here is his testimony.
Mr. Chairman, the security assistance that we provide, it takes many forms. One of the components of that, the security assistance that we provide, it takes many forms. One of the components of that assistance is counter battery radar. Another component are sniper weapons. These weapons and this assistance, it allows the Ukrainian military to deter further incursions by the Russians against Ukrainian territory. If that further incursion, further aggression were to take place, more Ukrainians would die. So it is a deterrent effect that these weapons provide. It's also the ability, it gives the Ukrainians the ability to negotiate from a position of a little more strength when they negotiate an end to the war in Donbass, negotiating with the Russians. This also is a way that would reduce the number of Ukrainians who would die.
Congress imposed certain conditions on the DoD assistance. Those conditions require DoD to hold half of the money in reserve. To release all of the funds, DoD, in coordination with the State Department, must conduct a review and certify to Congress that Ukraine has done enough to fight corruption. Now, President Trump may argue that the conditions imposed by Congress are similar to the hold he placed on aid to Ukraine. As Mick Mulvaney said, and I quote, "We do this all the time." But let us be very clear. These types of conditions, which are often included in appropriation bills, are designed to promote official U.S. policy, not the policy of one individual or one president. This is exactly the type of permissible condition on aid that Vice President Biden was implementing when he required that Ukraine fire its corrupt prosecutor general before getting a loan guarantee. Prior to 2019, the Trump administration provided security assistance to Ukraine without incident. Even under the previous Ukrainian administration of President Petro Poroshenko, which suffered from serious corruption, President Trump allowed $510 million in 2017 and $559 million in 2018 to flow unimpeded to Ukraine. But in the summer of 2019, without any explanation, President Trump abruptly withheld the security assistance to Ukraine. So what had changed by July of 2019? Congress had appropriated the funds. President Trump had signed it into law. The Department of Defense had certified that Ukraine was meeting the required anti-corruption reforms. In fact, DoD had begun to spend the funds. So what happened? Well, in April, two critical things happened. First, Joe Biden publicly announced his campaign for president. Second, the Mueller investigation concluded that Russia interfered in the 2016 U.S. elections to assist the Trump campaign, and that the Trump campaign had extensive contacts with Russians and even took advantage of some of the Russian efforts. The evidence shows that the only logical reason, and we deal in what's reasonable. President Trump withheld the aid. It was to undermine these threats to his political future. As we have discussed, security assistance to Ukraine has broad bipartisan support from Congress, as well as every agency within the president's own administration. And let us be clear about something. The money mattered to Ukraine. It mattered to Ukraine. Witness testimony revealed that this money was 10% of Ukraine's defense budget. 10%. Now imagine if President Trump just decided, without cause or explanation, to hold 10% of our own defense budget. That would have a dramatic impact on our military. And it certainly did to Ukraine, our ally. Keep in mind, too, that President Trump had to sign the bill into law, which he did in September of 2018. At no time during the congressional debate or passage of the bill did the White House express any concerns about the funding or the program itself. I want you to see the slide before us. President Trump signs bill authorizing aid to Ukraine for fiscal year 2019. On June 18, President Trump's own Department of Defense certified that Ukraine had met all of the anti-corruption requirements necessary to receive aid. And you know what? The Department of Defense announced that the money was on its way, just as we, the United States of America, had promised. Senators, our word must continue to mean something. Our word must continue to mean something powerful in the world. So let us make certain that America continues to live up to its promise.
That was Representative Val Demmings of Florida.
Mr. Chief Justice.
Now we have
and senators, thank you so
Representatives
much
of
for the attention
Lofgren,
that you have given
California.
to our presentation throughout this day.
You're welcome.
It's a long day.
Thank you.
You're here without
sleepy.
your cell phones or any access to other information.
I turned my
It's
cell phone
not
off.
easy, but you're paying attention, and the country and the managers thank you for that. Now, we've just gone through the importance of the security assistance to Ukraine, to our national security, and the clear consensus among Congress, the executive, and the president's agencies and advisors that the aid should be released to Ukraine. In fact, by June 18th, after having certified that Ukraine had met all the anti-corruption reform requirements to receive the aid, DOD announced its intention to provide the $250 million in security assistance to Ukraine. This brings us to the second part of this section of our argument. Soon after that June 18th press release, President Trump quickly moved to stop the aid from flowing. He did this with no explanation, against the clear consensus of his advisors and his agencies, and against our nation's security interests. And he was so determined to do it in order to pressure Ukraine to do his political dirty work that he was willing to violate the law, something his own officials were well aware of and worried about. How do we know the president ordered the hold? Well, first, there's no real dispute that the president ordered the hold. The hold on security assistance to Ukraine was a unilateral official act by the president. Immediately after the DOD's June 18th press release announcing the $250 million in security assistance funds for Ukraine, President Trump started asking questions about the funding programs. Laura Cooper from DOD and Mark Sandy from OMB testified about this sudden interest in Ukraine security assistance, something that Cooper called unusual. We, of course, have received no documents from OMB and DOD because of the president's obstruction. Why did the president want to hide these documents? We don't know. But thanks to Freedom of Information lawsuits and hardworking reporters, we know a little from the documents that we do have. For instance, we know that the day after the DOD press release, the president asked for information about the Ukraine aid. On June 19th, Michael Duffy, the Associate Director for National Security Programs at OMB, sent an email to Elaine McCusker, the DOD controller, with an article by the Washington Examiner reporting that, quote, Pentagon to send $250 million in weapons to Ukraine. In Duffy's email, he asked McCusker the following general question. The president has asked about this funding release, and I've been tasked to follow up with someone over there to get more detail. Do you have any insight on this funding? It seems that on June 19, Robert Blair, Mick Mulvaney's deputy, called acting OMB Director Russell Vought to discuss the Ukraine security assistance. He told him, we need to hold it up. That's right. The hold was actually directed impulsively, without any policy or agency review, as soon as President Trump apparently learned about it from press reports. And we know what was on the president's mind about Ukraine that day, because President Trump gave a phone interview with Sean Hannity on Fox News.
Listen to this.
During the interview, he mentioned the so-called CrowdStrike conspiracy theory that blames Ukraine rather than Russia for interfering in the 2016 election. Remember that President Trump raised the CrowdStrike theory a month later during his July 25th call with President Zelensky. And of course, as has been said many times, that theory has been completely refuted by U.S. intelligence agencies, as well as the president's own hand-picked senior advisors. The New York Times also reported that on June 27th, Mick Mulvaney sent Blair an email. Mulvaney wrote, I'm just trying to tie up some loose ends. Did we ever find out about the money for Ukraine and whether we could hold it back? What was Blair's response to Mulvaney? That it was possible to hold the security assistance, but Blair warned, expect Congress to become unhinged. Now, Blair, who'd previously worked for Congress, knew that Congress would be unhinged because there was overwhelming bipartisan support for Ukraine. Congress had already authorized the release of the funds. DOD had already told Congress and the world that it was going to spend the $250 million on Ukraine security assistance, and it had already started to do so. Mark Sandy, the senior career official at OMB responsible for this type of aid, couldn't recall any other time in his 12-year career at OMB when a hold had been placed on security assistance after a congressional notification was made. Later, if the president's counsel starts listing other times that aid has been held, ask yourself 3 questions. 1, had Congress already cleared the money to be released? 2, was there a significant geopolitical development in that country? And 3, did the GAO determine that the hold was illegal, in part because Congress was not notified? Here, the money had been cleared. There was nothing new or important in Ukraine to disrupt the aid, just that a true anti-corruption reformer was elected. The hold was illegal. From Freedom of Information releases and press reports, we know about just a few of the many documents being hidden from you about how the hold began. Given President Trump's obstruction, with the facts that have come to light through Freedom of Information Act lawsuits and news reporting, you may assume the documents that are being withheld would probably incriminate the president. Otherwise, why wouldn't he have provided them?
Exactly.
If he had a legitimate executive privilege claim, he could follow the rules and make each claim. Instead, he just said no to everything. By mid-July,
That's
the
obstruction.
president had put a hold on all the money. Jennifer Williams, special advisor to Vice President Pence for Europe, learned about the hold on July 3. She said it came out of the blue and hadn't previously been discussed by OMB or the National Security Council. The hold was never discussed with any policy experts in any of the relevant agencies. Now, that's remarkable. President Trump ordered a hold on congressionally appropriated funds without the benefit of any interagency deliberation, consultation, or advice. The evidence shows the president's hold was an impulsive decision unrelated to any American policy. On July 12th, Robert Blair, Mulvaney's deputy, emailed Duffy at OMB. He said, quote, "The president is directing a hold on military support funding for Ukraine." This is according to Sandy, the career officer at OMB, who got a copy of the email. Now, we don't have a copy of the email because of the president's obstruction. But here's what we do know from Mr. Sandy's description of the email, as well as testimony from other witnesses. The hold was not part of a larger review of foreign aid. We do know it was not the result of a policy debate about what was best for America. It came out of the blue. We now know why it was done, to turn the screws on Ukraine, to provide political help for the president. The hold was immediately suspect simply because of its timing. Duffy later asked Blair about the reasons for the hold. Blair gave no explanation. Instead, he said, quote, "We need to let the hold take place and then revisit the issue with the president." Blair either didn't know the reason or wouldn't share the real reason because it was corrupt. It sure would be nice to know what Blair knew about the reason for the hold and what Duffy knew. We could ask them the question, if you authorize a subpoena. Now, we had hoped, as we said, that the Senate would authorize subpoenas before our arguments were made. We thought it would have been helpful. But we know that you'll have another opportunity to call witnesses, to require documents, and we hope that your decision will be informed by the arguments we're making to you over these days, and that you will, in fact, get the full story. Well, we do know actually the reason why the president did what he did. We know the president held the money. It wasn't because of any policy reason to benefit America or any concern about corruption in Ukraine or any desire for more burden sharing from other countries. It was because the president was upset that Ukraine was not announcing the investigations that he wanted, because he wanted to ramp up the pressure to force them to do it. From the very beginning, it was clear the hold was not in America's national interest. Those within the US government responsible for Ukraine's security and for shaping and implementing US foreign policy were caught off guard by the president's decision. Support for the aid and against the hold was unanimous, forceful, and unwavering. The president can call Ukraine policy experts unelected bureaucrats all he wants, but those are officers charged with implementing his official policy, developed by the president himself, which was also a product of congressional action. Anyway, it wasn't just the career officers. President Trump's own politically appointed senior officials, his cabinet members, also opposed the hold. Why? Because it was against our national interest. But the president wasn't persuaded by arguments about national interest. Why? Because the hold had nothing to do with the national interest. It had to do with the interests of just one person, Donald J. Trump. The demand for Ukraine to announce these investigations was not a policy decision, but a personal decision by the president to benefit his own personal interests. At an NSC-led meeting on July 8th, OMB announced that President Trump had directed a hold on Ukraine security assistance. The news shocked meeting participants. Ambassador Taylor testified.
Does this every couple hours. We got to keep asking to resume playback. Yes, I'm still here. I'm not stopping. I'm a good American. I'm a patriot. And what I want to do is I want to know the truth. And already I know, even from what limited information the House managers are presenting to the Senate, I know that this man has abused his office. And I am
C-SPAN, your unfiltered view of government, created by cable in 1979.
If Republicans, oh God, if you do this,
There was great confusion among the rest of us because we didn't understand why that had happened. He explained, since there was unanimity about this security assistance to Ukraine, that it was in our national interest, it just surprised all of us. The policy consensus at this and later NSC meetings was clear. With the exception of OMB, which was following the direction of the president, everyone supported lifting the hold, all the way up to number 2 officials at the agencies, the political appointees of President Trump. There was unanimous agreement that the hold was ill-advised and the aid should be released. Tim Morrison, National Security Advisor to John Bolton, understood that the most senior appointed officials were all supportive of the continued disbursement of the aid. On August 15th, at the President's Golf Club in Bedminster, New Jersey, members of the President's cabinet all represented to Ambassador Bolton that they were prepared to tell the President they endorsed the swift release and disbursement of the funding. The President ignored his advisor's recommendation to lift the hold. He provided no credible explanation for it, not from the day the hold was made until the day it was lifted. Witness after witness, including Hale, Vindman, Croft, Holmes, Kent, Cooper, Sandy, testified they weren't given any reason for the hold while it was in place. Croft said the only reason given was that the order came at the direction of the president. Mr. Holmes confirmed the order had come from the president without further explanation. Kent testified too. I don't recall any coherent explanation. Ambassador Sondland agreed. I was never given a straight answer as to why it had been put in place to begin with. Dr. Hill explained, no, there was no reason given. Even Senator McConnell has said, I was not given an explanation for the hold. Even as OMB was implementing the hold, officers in OMB were saying it should be lifted. Mr. Sandy testified that his team drafted a memo on August 7th to OMB Acting Director Russ Vought. It recommended lifting the hold because, 1, the assistance was consistent with national security to support a stable, peaceful Europe. 2, the aid countered Russian aggression. 3, there was bipartisan support for the program. Michael Duffy, the senior political appointee overseeing funds, approved the memorandum. He agreed with its policy recommendations, and it wasn't just OMB. Senior advisors in the administration tried over and over again to convince President Trump to lift the hold over the summer. Sometime prior to August 16th, Ambassador Bolton had a one-on-one meeting with President Trump about the aid, but the president didn't budge. Then, at the end of August, when the hold on the aid became public, Ambassador Taylor expressed to multiple officials his concerns about withholding the aid from Ukraine at a time when it was fighting Russia. Ambassador Taylor stressed the importance of the hold, not just as a message to Ukraine, but importantly to Russia as well. Withholding the aid on vital military assistance while Ukraine was in the midst of a hot war with Russia sent a message to Russia about U.S. support of Ukraine. Ambassador Taylor felt so strongly about the harm withholding the security assistance that for the first time ever in his decades of service at the State Department, he sent a first-person cable with his concerns to Secretary Pompeo.
First time ever.
In the cable, he described directly the folly that Taylor saw in withholding the aid. Here's his testimony.
I remember this.
Have you ever sent a cable like that? How many times in your career, 40, 50 years, have you sent a cable directly to the Secretary of State?
Once.
This time?
Yes, sir.
In 50 years?
Rifle company banners don't send cables, but yes, sir.
Ambassador Taylor never received an answer to the cable, but he was told that Secretary Pompeo carried it with him to a White House meeting about security assistance to Ukraine. It seemed this meeting about the aid may have occurred on August 30th. There are press reports that Secretary Pompeo, Secretary Esper, National Security Advisor Bolton discussed the hold with President Trump shortly after Ambassador Taylor sent his cable. Keep this in mind. This was 2 days after the hold was publicly reported and after the president was briefed on the whistleblower complaint. Yet, even then, President Trump refused to release the aid. On August 30th, Michael Duffy sent an email to Elaine McCusker, the DOD comptroller. It said, quote, "Clear direction from POTUS to continue the hold. President Trump has refused to produce this or any other email to Congress. When the administration was forced to produce it in a Freedom of Information case in response to a court order, this critical passage was actually blacked out." What's the reason for blacking out this direction from the president about an issue so central to this case?
Obstruction.
No reason has been given to us. So you should ask yourself this: what is the president hiding? The president finally released the hold on September 11th, but again, there was no credible reason given for the release. Mark Sandy testified that he could not recall another instance where a significant amount of assistance was being held up, and he didn't have a rationale for as long as I didn't have a rationale in this case. On the day it was released, OMB still didn't know why President Trump had ordered the hold. On September 11th, the day the president finally released the aid, McCusker at DOD reportedly sent an email to Duffy asking, "What happened?" Michael Duffy answered, "Not clear exactly, but President made the decision to go. We'll fill you in when I get details." So let's take a step back for a minute. Why was no reason given to anyone for the president deciding to hold up hundreds of millions of dollars in military assistance to our allies? Because there was no supportable reason for withholding the aid. No one agreed with it. According to the 17 witnesses in the House impeachment inquiry, President Trump insisted on holding the aid and provided no reason, despite unanimous support, for lifting a hold throughout his administration, including his hand-picked top advisors. It also wasn't consistent with American policy. The aid had the clear support of career officers and political appointees in President Trump's administration as important for national security. There was no national security or foreign policy reason provided. No one could think of one. DOD had already certified to Congress, as the law required, that Ukraine had met the anti-corruption conditions for the aid and that it planned to begin implementing the expenditures. So why did the president do this? I think we know why. The president ordered the hold for an improper purpose, to pressure Ukraine to announce investigations that would personally benefit President Trump. And that brings us to a key point. It wasn't just that the president ordered a hold on the aid without any explanation, against the unanimous advice of his advisors, and even after for weeks, as his administration, both career and political appointees, continued to try to get him to release the hold. What the president was trying to hide was worse. What the president did was not just wrong, it was illegal.
That's right.
In ordering the hold, President Trump not only took a position contrary to his senior advisors, counter to congressional intent, and adverse to American national security interests in Ukraine, he also violated the law. Now, this issue was not a surprise. From the start of the hold in July, compliance with the Impoundment Control Act was a significant concern for OMB and DOD officials. Mark Sandy raised concerns with his supervisor, Michael Duffy, that the hold might violate the Impeachment Control Act. DOD voiced the same concerns. Laura Cooper from DOD described the discussion at a July 26 meeting with number 2 officials at all of the relevant agencies about the hold, stating, quote, "Immediately, deputies began to raise concerns about how this could be done in a legal fashion. She further testified that there was no legal mechanism to use to implement the hold after Congress had been notified of the release of the funding. At a July 31st meeting with more junior officials, Laura Cooper put all attendees on notice, including representatives of the White House, that because, quote, there were only 2 legally available options and we do not have direction to pursue either, close quote, DOD would have to start spending the funds on or about August 6th. In other words, the president had a choice. He could release the aid or he could break the law. He chose to break the law. He was so determined to turn up the pressure on Ukraine that he kept the hold for no legitimate purpose and without any congressional notification for long enough to violate the law. The concerns from OMB and DOD were ultimately accurate. As has been mentioned just last week, the Nonpartisan Government Accountability Office found that President Trump broke the law by implementing the hold and in failing to notify Congress about it. Because of the president's hold, DOD was ultimately unable to spend all the $250 million in security assistance before the end of the fiscal year, as Congress, as we intended. Now, as GAO explained, the Constitution grants the president no unilateral authority to withhold funds from obligation. And they further explained, faithful execution of the law does not permit the president to substitute his own policy priorities for those that Congress has enacted into law. OMB withheld funds for a policy reason which is not permitted under the Impoundment Control Act, end quote. Now, bottom line, President Trump froze the aid to increase the pressure on Ukraine to announce the investigations he wanted. He violated the law. He violated his constitutional duty to take care that the laws be faithfully executed. But the president didn't just violate the Impoundment Control Act while pressuring Ukraine to announce the investigations he wanted. He was dishonest about it in the process. And this is really telling because he's still not telling the truth about it even now. The budget documents that implemented the hold until September 11th asserted that it was being imposed to, quote, allow for an interagency process to determine the best use of such funds. But that wasn't true. There was no ongoing interagency process after July 31st, after it became clear that the entire interagency, including cabinet officers, unanimously agreed the aid should be released. The truth is, there simply was no debate or review in the interagency regarding the best use of such funds. So the reason given by the president was not only illegal, it was false too. The dishonesty in the budget documents weren't the only steps that the president's men at OMB took to cover up his misconduct and enable his scheme.
Obstruction.
OMB went so far as to remove the authority to approve the budget documents from Mark Sandy, a career officer, and gave it to Michael Duffy, a political appointee without experience managing such documents. This change was unusual. It occurred less than 2 weeks after Sandy raised concerns that the hold violated the law. Sandy was not aware of any prior instance when a political appointee assumed this kind of funding approval authority. Duffy's explanation that he simply wanted to learn more about the accounts, that just didn't make sense to Sandy. Really, this odd change in responsibility was just another way to keep the president's illegal hold within a tight-knit unit of loyal soldiers within the OMB. Michael Duffy defied the House's subpoena. At the president's direction, he refused to appear. Now, the House did not assert any privileges or immunities when it directed Duffy to defy Congress's subpoena. It wasn't a real exercise of executive privilege. They told him not to appear, and they had no reason why. If Mr. Duffy knew about any legitimate reason for the hold, I'll bet he would not have been blocked from testifying. The fact that he was blocked might lead you to infer that his testimony would be damaging to the president and would be consistent with the testimony of the other witnesses that the hold was solely used to ratchet up pressure on Ukraine. But the warnings from DOD weren't just about how the hold was illegal, there were also practical consequences. By August 12th, the Department of Defense told OMB it could no longer guarantee it would be able to spend all $250 million that Congress had directed before the end of the fiscal year. Not long after this August 12th email, DOD determined that time had run out. Ms. Cooper testified that DOD estimated that as much as $100 million of aid might go unspent, even if the hold was immediately lifted. As a result, DOD refused to certify that it would be able to spend the funds by September 30th. On August 20th, OMB issued the first of 6 budget documents and removed the language providing legal cover for the hold. From that point on, the White House knew that DOD would not be able to spend all the funds, which was what the law required before September 30th. And yet, even though he knew the hold would violate the Impeachment Control Act, President Trump continued the hold for another 23 days without telling us, without telling the Congress. This had the exact outcome that DOD feared. After the president lifted the hold on the evening of September 11th, DOD had only 18 days to spend the remaining $223 million, which is about 89% of the total. DOD scrambled, and they spent all but approximately $35 million, about 14% of the appropriated funds were left. That $35 million would have expired and would have been forever lost to Ukraine had Congress not stepped in to pass a law to roll the money over to the next year. But even as of today, more than $18 million of that money has not yet been spent. Why? You'll have to ask DOD. They haven't given us a reason. Okay, all of this shows clearly that President Trump knowingly, willfully violated the law when he withheld aid from Ukraine. But just to be clear, the articles of impeachment do not charge Donald Trump with violating the Impeachment Control Act. We're not arguing that. But understanding this violation of the law is important to understand the broader scheme of his abuse of power. It shows the great lengths the president was willing to go to in order to pressure Ukraine to do his political dirty work. The security assistance wasn't something the law allowed him to give or take at his discretion. No, he was legally obliged to release the money, but he simply didn't care. Why? He was so determined to get the announcement from Ukraine to smear his election opponent that holding the aid to force Ukraine to do that was the most important thing. He didn't care if he was breaking the law. You know, I've been sitting here on the Senate floor, and honestly, I never wanted to be here under these circumstances. But I've been looking at Novus Ordo Seclorum. Now, I didn't study Latin, so I had to look it up. And it said, a new order of the ages is born. That's what the founders thought they were doing. Keeping that new order, the democracy, where the power is in the hands of the people, not in the hands of an unaccountable executive, is what we in the Congress, the House, and the Senate are charged to do.
Thank you.
Senator Blunt and I are in charge of the Joint Committee on Printing. And every year, we print a new copy of the Constitution. And this year, in the back, we printed a quote. At the conclusion of the Constitutional Convention, Benjamin Franklin was asked, "What have you wrought?" And he answered, "A republic, if you can keep it." That's the challenge that all of us face and that you senators face. I turn now to Mr. Crow, who will outline information about the president's intentions.
I think I'm going to have to call it, guys. Yep. So I'm going to call it here and listen to the rest on the radio.
Mr. Chief Justice, members of the Senate, counsel for the president, just bear with us a little